For bomber crews in World War II, the difference between coming home and dying in a burning wreck often came down to which aircraft they were strapped into. With over half of all aircrew killed on operations, today we are ranking every major bomber of the war, from the flying coffins that doomed their crews to the sky dominators that changed warfare forever. Some bombers killed their own crews through catastrophic design failures that turned every mission into a death lottery. The aircraft that earned their place at the bottom of our ranking did so through engineering disasters and fatal flaws that no amount of courage could overcome. The Soviet Tupolev TB3 looked impressive on paper, but became a death trap in practice. Originally powered by 4 Mikulin M17 engines, the aircraft proved unreliable in service, and the engines tended to overheat rapidly, a catastrophic liability when operating 200 miles behind enemy lines. A shortage of combat-ready aircraft forced the Soviet Air Force to deploy TB3 aircraft in daylight without fighter escort, and at low to medium altitudes, they suffered devastating losses to enemy fighters and ground fire. The corrugated metal skin and lumbering speed made them easy targets, but it was the engine failures that transformed routine missions into one-way trips. At the start of the Great Patriotic War on 22nd of June 1941, the Soviet Air Force had 516 operational TB3 aircraft. By August 1941, most were restricted to night missions only. Daylight operations had become suicidal. The German Heinkel He-111 presented a different kind of fatal flaw. Originally designed in 1934 as a high-speed transport, a thin disguise for its true purpose as a bomber in the secretly rearming Luftwaffe, the He-111 was fast and modern when it entered service. By 1939, however, fighter development had already outpaced it, and the Battle of Britain exposed the lethal gap. Its defensive armament and speed were woefully inadequate against determined fighter opposition. What had seemed like a technological marvel became a coffin. Knowing that the TB3's engine failures and the He-111's weak defenses turned crews into sitting ducks, which would you rather fly, the unreliable Soviet bomber or the defenseless German one? Comment your thoughts below. But these aircraft were just the beginning of our deadly countdown. Between these worst performers and the bomber that would dominate the skies, a middle tier of aircraft emerged. Bombers that were neither catastrophic failures nor revolutionary successes. These workhorses of the war faced their own challenges, but managed to survive through different combinations of defensive firepower, operational tactics, and technological adaptations. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress epitomized this middle tier, heavily armed but dangerously vulnerable. Picture yourself in the waist gunner position as enemy fighters close in from 3 o'clock. The B-17's defensive philosophy centered on bristling with machine guns, with 13 defensive positions in later variants, creating overlapping fields of fire that could theoretically protect the aircraft from any angle. But theory met brutal reality over German-occupied Europe, where coordinated fighter attacks and concentrated flak fields turned formation flying into a deadly gamble. The B-17's armor and self-sealing fuel tanks kept many crews alive when other bombers would have exploded, but its operational ceiling of around 35,000 feet left it within range of both fighters and anti-aircraft artillery. Crews learned to read the sky like a deadly map. Black puffs of flak at their altitude meant someone on the ground had their range, while the glint of sunlight on distant wings could signal incoming fighters. The aircraft's legendary toughness came at a cost. Fully loaded, it was slow and predictable, making it an easier target for experienced enemy pilots. The British Avro Lancaster represented a different approach to survival, payload over protection. Where the B-17 bristled with guns, the Lancaster carried bigger bombs. Its massive bomb bay could accommodate the largest conventional weapons of the war, but this came with a trade-off in defensive armament. Imagine sitting in the rear turret on a night mission over the Ruhr Valley, knowing that if a German night fighter found you, your survival depended more on darkness and evasive maneuvers than firepower. Lancaster crews developed their own survival tactics, flying at night to avoid the worst of the fighter threat, using electronic countermeasures to confuse radar-guided defenses, and relying on the skill of their pilots to throw the heavy bomber around the sky like a fighter when attacked. The aircraft's Merlin engines were reliable, but engine failure over enemy territory meant a long, dangerous glide toward either friendly territory or captivity. The North American B-25 Mitchell took yet another path through the deadly middle ground, trading payload for agility. Medium bombers like the Mitchell couldn't carry the massive bomb loads of their heavy cousins, but they could twist and turn through valleys, skim treetops, and attack targets that four-engine bombers couldn't reach. Picture flying at 50 feet above the Pacific, salt spray hitting your windscreen as you line up for a skip bombing attack on a Japanese destroyer. The Mitchell's twin engines and relatively light weight made it nimble enough for these suicide runs, but also fragile enough that a single hit from ship-based anti-aircraft guns could bring it down. These medium bombers faced a unique challenge. They operated in the most dangerous altitude band, too low to avoid ground fire, but too high to use terrain for consistent cover. Crews learned to read the landscape below like a tactical manual, which ridgelines offered concealment, which valleys became death traps, which coastlines provided escape routes back to friendly territory. The Soviet Ilyushin Il-4 demonstrated how middle-tier bombers adapted to desperate circumstances. Originally designed as a long-range bomber, it ended up flying everything from strategic missions deep into German territory to close support for ground troops. Soviet crews pushed these aircraft beyond their design limits, overloading them with fuel for maximum range, stripping out defensive guns to carry more bombs, and flying missions that Western air forces would have considered impossible. Each of these middle-tier bombers survived through different combinations of crew skill, tactical adaptation, and sheer luck. They weren't flying death traps like the worst aircraft, but they weren't invulnerable sky fortresses either. They existed in the dangerous middle ground, where survival depended as much on the decisions made in the cockpit as the capabilities built into the airframe. While those bombers earned their deadly reputation through failure, the aircraft that claimed the #1 position achieved its lethality through devastating effectiveness. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress didn't just survive its missions, it obliterated entire cities and reshaped the very nature of warfare. From November 24, 1944 to August 14, 1945, B-29s operating from the Marianas achieved a 1.2% loss rate in aircraft and 0.8% in crews, a stark contrast to the catastrophic attrition of earlier bombers. The B-29 achieved what the TB-3 and He-111 could never accomplish: operational dominance through technological superiority. It could fly at 10,200 meters, above the service ceiling of most Japanese fighters and beyond the effective range of most anti-aircraft weapons. Where the He-111 fell victim to fighter attacks and the TB-3 suffered engine failures, the B-29 simply flew above the threat. On July 15, 1945, when 444 B-29s attacked Osaka, not a single Japanese fighter rose to intercept them. The Japanese air defense had effectively collapsed. The strategic impact was unprecedented. On March 9th and 10th, 1945, more than 300 B-29s dropped close to 250,000 incendiary bombs over Tokyo, in darkness at low altitudes, killing perhaps as many as 100,000 civilians, destroying almost 16 square miles of the city, and leaving 1 million people homeless. This firebombing became the single most destructive air raid in history, a demonstration of how one aircraft type could reshape the outcome of an entire war. Subscribe for more military rankings. Next up, the fighter aircraft that hunted these bombers from the sky.